There was perhaps nothing as divisive to the Ethiopian student movement as the national question. The diverse makeup of Ethiopia's multi-ethnic state cannot be overlooked, as the dawn of the revolution made it a pertinent question needing answering and realizing what a new, equitable, socialist Ethiopia could look like. The national question came to the forefront of the student movement's agenda in the late 1960s and early 70s, where the question was debated in the 17th Congress of the Ethiopian Student Union of North America in September 1969, and it was also their topic of their February 1970 issue of Challenge, their organizational publication. It was also discussed by the Ethiopian Student Union in Europe in their 11th Congress in 1971. And so this is where the ideological battle within the movement really begins to start in earnest over the national question. Though this ideological split over the national question ushers in the complex historical sequence of events in the history of the student movement that is actually covered in detail in this book, Quest for Socialist Utopia, by Ruzode. It is best simplified, as he does in here, as a struggle over whether self-determination in the context of the national question, which was at one point termed the regional question, or the class question, was the preeminent problem in struggling to overthrow feudalism and imperialism in a multinational state like Ethiopia. Hello, this is Editing Soliana here, and I should probably mention before I continue on with this video that the reason why the students used feudalism to conceptualize what they saw was the reality of Ethiopia was because at this point in time, Ethiopia was not a fully sort of capitalist economy in the way that we understand it today. And so the farmers, the peasantry that made up the largest population of Ethiopian society outside of the capital particularly were living in a very poverty-stricken socioeconomic context, and this was partly engendered by the tax system, the way that the land system worked, which was different in the north than in the south. But the farmers worked the land that they did not own, and they paid rent to the landlords, to the absentee landlords who made up the nobility. So one example of how the students really conceptualized this was Desalegn Ramato's article on feudalism, and Baruzade cites him when talking about this concept. So Desalegn Ramato writes, "The structure of Ethiopian feudalism is in many respects almost identical with that of medieval Europe. Within this theoretical framework, Desalegn examines in more detail the manifestations of tenancy, Ethiopia's version of serfdom in the various provinces, giving figures compiled from the Ministry of Land Reform survey cited above for the mode of rent payment and the percentage of absentee landlords. He identifies three major classes in rural Ethiopia: the large land-owning aristocracy, the local gentry and peasantry, where the last eats out a life of impoverishment and insecurity, being the first to suffer and the last to recover from any economic hazard. In general, lulled by the teachings of the church, he curses his fate for his condition. In extreme circumstances, however, he rises in rebellion, as happened in Tigray, Gojam, and Bali." So this is how, for example, Desalegn Ramato sees feudalism. Both groups of students used Marxist thinking in exploring national self-determination, but the conclusions they drew in the particulars of Ethiopia were different. The guiding tracks over these debates have been nicely termed the TT thesis and the TL thesis. We'll talk about why it was termed that, who wrote these theses, and the sort of pseudonyms they used. And the former, the TT thesis, hails the national question, and the latter, the TL thesis, really hails the class question. It is through these tracts and the February 1970 issue of Challenge that I'll talk a little bit about the roles that nationality and ethnicity played in the students' definition of change and revolution. This is actually a chapter of my master's thesis where I, use the Ethiopian student movement as a sort of case study to look at it as an expression of the Black radical tradition, in the Ethiopian context, in the African context, in the student activism, student movement context, to see, how this idea of the Black radical tradition as conceptualized by Cedric Robinson played out in this particular moment of Ethiopian history. So the national question, or as the Ethiopian Student Union in North America at one point termed it, the regional question, and we'll start referring to them as ISANA or ISUNA. It's the same organization. It was a matter taken up by these organizations in 17th Congress, and their February 1970 challenge was dedicated to documenting the written arguments that were presented for the debate at the Congress and the resolutions that were made from them. So some of the articles that were featured were The Problems of Regionalism and Religion, Some Theoretical Considerations by Andreas Eshete, Problems of Regionalism in Ethiopia by Hagos Gebreyesus, Problem of Religion in Ethiopia by Medles Ayelo, and Regionalism and National Liberation, Some Observations by Alam Haptu. Though they tackle different aspects of the national question and weave in the role and appropriateness of self-determination to the situation of Ethiopia, all their pieces really unite under the idea that regionalism and religion were one of the structures from which the Ethiopian poor were exploited and oppressed by the Ethiopian bourgeoisie and allyship with Western imperialism. This is sort of part of their philosophy where they, are against imperialism and against, feudalism. Anti-imperialism, anti-feudalism is sort of a campaign, an ideological campaign that the students had because they saw the way that imperialism and feudalism work together to oppress the Ethiopian poor. And so talking about the national question, one really cannot begin the discussion of the national question in the student moon without first taking up with Wallein Mekonnen and his canon essay in the history of the student movement, titled On the Question of Nationalities in Ethiopia. So in this book, Baru notes that there are, various explanations that led to such a controversial writing, both of the, materialist and psychoanalytical kind. But what's important is how the national question, as articulated by Wallein, impacted the succeeding arguments, whether in agreement or dissent, with the overall movement in the 1970s. So Wallein begins his essay by noting, much like Lenin in his Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism, that he does not attempt to undertake a sort of, systematic empirical study of the role nationality plays in the struggle against the regime, but rather to, quote, provoke discussions on the sacred, yet very important issue of this country, the question of nationalities, unquote. So Wallein argues that Ethiopia is not a nation, but is rather, quote, made up of a dozen nationalities with their own languages, ways of dressing, history, social organization, and territorial entity, unquote. Hence, this is why he says that in Ethiopia, there is the Oromo nation, the Tigray nation, the Amhara nation, the Gurage nation, and so on. Wallein cringes away from the term tribal and does not at all employ region and regionalism as terminology in his formulations, but neither does he qualify whether nation can sort of equally be applied or if the groups meet all the criteria of nationhood as he sort of has conceptualized it. He notes how the very image that Ethiopia evokes is one of Amhara Tigray culture, a result of the chauvinism that the bourgeois sector of this nationality has practiced throughout Ethiopian history. So he says, to be a genuine Ethiopian, one has to speak Amharic, to listen to Amharic music, to accept the Amhara Tigray Shema in international conferences. In some cases, to be an Ethiopian, you will even have to change your name. In short, to be an Ethiopian, you will have to wear an Amhara mask, to use Fanon's expression, unquote. However, Wallein takes note to not essentialize cultural chauvinism as a predilection of the Amhara or the Tigray. He notes Amharas are no dominant because of inherent imperialist tendencies. The Oromos could have done it, the Wallamos could have done it, unquote. Hence, the real work of resistance as he conceptualized it must be the promotion of, he says, a state in which all nationalities participate equally in the state affairs, a state where every nationality is given equal opportunity to preserve and develop its language, its music, and its history. A state where no nation dominates another nation, be it economically or culturally. Now, Wallein deals with the complication that the question of secession and class pose by arguing that, quote, as long as secession is led by the peasants and workers and believes in its internationalist obligation, it is not only to be supported but also militarily assisted, unquote. So like the TT thesis, what actually stands for the Talahun Taleka thesis, that will be, discussed a little bit later, Wallein argues that secession in and of itself need not be demonized, that the real questions worth asking is whether the secessionist movement is progressive or reactionary, and of course whether it is socialist. However, Wallein does not confer a blanket rejection of secessionist movements, whether it were to be determined that they are indeed reactionary. This is because he says the revolution can start anywhere. It can even be secessionist to begin with, as long as led by the progressive forces, the peasants and the workers, and has the final aim, the liberation of the Ethiopian mass, with due consideration to the economic and cultural independence of all the nationalities. So it seems that Wallein was of the opinion that one need not circumscribe the ways that resistance manifests itself, be it secessionist or not, if it is led by the masses. And some, Wallein reconciles the national question, the class question, and secession by maintaining that as long as the actors behind the movement or secession are of the peasantry and working class, and whether their resistance manifests along nationalistic lines won't be of, great significance. Quote, if in the long run socialism is internationalism and a socialist movement will never remain secessionist for good. So it has to have at its basis a worker peasant led secessionist movement that which inherently will be socialist, and since socialism is inherently internationalist, a secessionist movement will not only its end goal will not only be secession, right? Its end goal will be socialism, which is inherently internationalism. So there's a little bit of some assumption happening there, but that's his position, that we don't really need to critique, or, well, he doesn't particularly say that, but we don't need to demonize any secessionist movement because it's probably on the trajectory of a socialist revolution. It's probably how we could sort of think about it. And so he doesn't really criticize the Eritrean secessionist movement, for example, even though there are other sectors of the Ethiopian student movement where they did at least critique the sort of conceptualization of how the Eritrean secessionist movement was characterized by certain people. Some students didn't like that it was seen as this colonial relationship. They prefer to see it as something that would be more a feudalistic relationship, where the Ethiopian Empire, ruled the Eritrean region and other regions of the Ethiopian Empire through conquest, not necessarily this colonial conquest, which has within it this sort of metropole, periphery sort of dynamic, where it has with it, obviously the racial aspect of it too. And to a certain extent, you can make that argument that existed, but that, I guess, it wasn't an ideological sort of place where some students felt comfortable, seeing Ethiopia as the sort of colonially dominating force of the other regions. But that's a whole, debate that existed that I'm not totally going to get into in this particular video, but that was also a question there. So Wallein's 1969 formulations, right, this essay of the national question and the struggle against Haile Selassie's regime, feudalism and imperialism, became the topic of more rigorous and empirical examination by that of ASUNA, the North American wing of the student movement, in their 17th Congress. So in this issue of challenge, the first article by Andreas Echete goes into the notion of self-determination and its bourgeois tendencies to argue how it may not really neatly fit into the framework of a popular working class and peasantry-based resistance movement that is inherently multinational. And so by noting how the Ethiopian bourgeoisie is aligned with the imperial government in class and political interests, and then noting how their version of self-determination is what he says the creation of a state which serves as the instrument for the fulfillment of the interests of the bourgeoisie, right? The state reflects the, class interests and the political interests of the bourgeoisie. Andreas pushes for a nuanced take on national self-determination, one that has at its basis an anti-feudal and anti-imperialist orientation. And so it's not that Andreas was articulating a resistance to the entire notion of self-determination, but rather to point out how, without taking into account the class basis of oppression, which first and foremost unites all varieties of Ethiopian people to their relationship with their oppressors, cause of national self-determination can fall flat, especially because he says these feudal crusaders did not exclude any of Ethiopia's peoples from conquest on the basis of tribe, religion, language, and culture. Rather, they attempted to establish dependent relations between man and man through conquest and dispossession. At the same time, however, Andreas takes care to note that the question of regionalism cannot be ignored in the fight for liberation, nor can the masses be blamed for characterizing their struggle along ethnic lines or secondary features, as Andreas puts it, when on the surface, their oppression manifests through such lines as well. So he says that People's Liberation Movement takes up one of the many forms of oppression as a focus for mobilization at various stages of a struggle. Some of these are exclusively part of the secondary development peculiar to the concrete conditions of a particular people. Their regional and religious domination of oppressed groups in Ethiopia is a part of the overwhelming everyday reality of the masses. And so that socioeconomic oppressions manifest themselves along ethnic lines while obscuring the primary class contradiction was also a point made by Hagos in the next article. He says, in Ethiopia as elsewhere, the problem is and has always been one of social injustices. This injustice necessarily involves and manifests itself in religious, linguistic, and cultural oppressions. The basis of these oppressions is socioeconomic and political. This fact, as we shall see, is one which ruling classes, regardless of their ethnic and regional groupings, never forget. And this is because, as Alem Haptu concurs in the third article of this issue, in a society where the economic basis of power is land, i.e. feudal property relations, and where the sphere of socio-economic relations is regional, the tendency of the ruling class, as well as the ruled class, is to embrace a regionalist outlook. Once the relationship between social structure and level of economic development is grasped, it is not difficult to see why feudalist ruling classes exploit regional differences. So again, this is this primary contradiction of the class. So the SUNA students, the Ethiopian Student Union students, with the writings of the above three, conclude the primacy of the class contradiction while also still maintaining the question of regionalism is another important, however secondary, matter that needs resolving in the liberation struggle. Ethiopia's diverse makeup, however, still pushes the question of national self-determination to the forefront. Hence, Andreas provides a sort of sobering analysis of the role of self-determination in the Ethiopian context. He says, what needs to be stressed is the importance of empirical considerations to the principle of self-determination. It is crucial to the decision over the principle of self-determination to see if the primary development within which the principle found justification is met in the particular history of Ethiopia. In spite of these reservations on the relevance of the wider uses of the principle of self-determination to Ethiopia, there is an important legitimate content to the principle. It is important to fight for the equality of the regions and religions of Ethiopia. While noting that natural self-determination is an important banner from which to wage their struggle against feudalism and imperialism, Andreas maintains that it is still important to have an empirical understanding of the conditions of the various groups in Ethiopia to determine the extent to which self-determination is possible in the way that we understand it, in a way where Ethiopia again has so many groups, right? It's the idea that no one group has developed the same over time. And being cognizant of this and sort of correcting for it is crucial. And so while identifying the same issue, Hagos more explicitly argues that the way out, quote, from the dangers of divisive regionalism and ethnocentricity is to adopt socialism, which by definition is one and the same act as being opposed to feudalism and imperialism. So as Bahru notes in this book, the nuance and analysis of the articles provided were, quote, not evident in resolutions that eventually came out of this Congress. So the resolutions open with a clear-cut condemnation of regionalism along with feudalism and imperialism. It also, quote, opposes all separatist movements since their objective is contrary to the Ethiopian people's emancipation from feudalism and imperialism because it regards any movement based on separation or religion as essentially counter-revolutionary and detrimental to the struggle of the Ethiopian people against feudalism and imperialism, unquote. So the resolutions not take into account the ways in which regionalism, right, must be answered to in a way that does not betray the main contradictions of class. It outright condemned it in any group that would want to secede. And so the question of secession in the Eritrean context was taken up most directly by Andreas, who argues that the separatist movement in Eritrea is one informed by the sort of false notion that Eritrea, like I mentioned earlier, as a region of Ethiopia, is a colonized nation separate from the development of the rest of the Ethiopian people. So Andreas writes, it has been contended that certain regions in present Ethiopia have been subject to Ethiopian colonization. This, for example, has been part of the claim put forth by advocates of secession in Eritrea. But this rationale rests on mistaken analysis. Colonization, even in a primitive form, requires manufactured production. So on top of, the sort of history that I mentioned that is come with colonization, the idea of this manufactured production, this sort of metropole periphery relationship that is informed by, material conditions, as in what's being extracted from the peripheries to sort of swell the coffers and the war chest of the colonial empire. He's saying this wasn't really the exact relationship. This sort of crucial aspect of colonialism wasn't there, and so he says this was not a prerequisite that Ethiopia possessed. And so he says with feudalism, one can speak of conquest, not colonization, and this is a quite different matter. So he understands that the relationship that the Ethiopian Empire had with Eritrea and its other regions, was one of conquest, a feudal conquest, and not one he sees as colonization per se. And for some, that could just be a semantic difference. But for Andreas, it's not. He says that, and so that Andreas did not, outright condemn secession and separatist movements, though he might have internally believed them counterproductive, could have been a rhetorical tactic to ensure that his position on self-determination does not get obscured. But again, this would have been in vain, since the resolutions, the rather simplified resolutions, garnered an infamous response written sometime in 1970, now termed the Thesis. And so, though by 1971 the Ethiopian Student Union in Europe championed the national question as the preeminent problem to be solved in the fight against feudalism and imperialism, in a letter written to the 17th Congress of Asuna, which would be penned presumably in the months preceding September 1969, the Student Union in Europe writes, "The regional, ethnic, and religious character that the agitation has occasionally assumed must not be allowed to obstruct the fundamental class struggle of national liberation." And so it was not until the watered-down resolutions of the 17th Congress of the North American wing that the infamous TT Thesis was published in response, hailing national self-determination as nothing less than the right of political self-determination, i.e. the right to secede and form a separate state. So the TT Thesis, which was a pseudonym, the Tlahuntakala Thesis, bases his notion of nations and self-determination really close to the Stalinist sense. Andreas Achete's article, which also uses Stalin-Lenin's definition of nations and self-determination in his thinking, however, makes one sensitive to applying the term to the Ethiopian context without first judging whether the historical conditions of Ethiopia warranted such a strict application. TT asserts that countries like Ethiopia can be saved from national strife only if they recognize the right of self-determination of the nations and nationalities within them. And TT, is a pseudonym particularly for Brahma Meskalreda, who was also an organizer in the, student movement and intellectual, and it's highly believed that the TT Thesis actually was run by him. And further, TT argued that with the recognition of self-determination came the right of secession, where, quote, such a right is essential for a multinational organization that has the agenda of overcoming feudalism and imperialism. So what is clear is that TT was concerned over the fact that the outright condemnation of such movements on their demands and the rejection of their right to self-determination, including secession, is neither democratic nor will it solve the problem. So that the 17th Congress's resolution garnered such a response is not entirely surprising, since it read like a resolute rejection of the national question as a problem not worth grappling with in this struggle against feudalism and imperialism. And so TT maintained that the struggle cannot continue in earnest without the recognition of national self-determination and the right to secede for all nations and nationalities of Ethiopians. And this is concurring with the Stalinist definition of nations that students in the Student Union in North America also employed, that a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Like Stalin, TT holds that the right to secession does not mean, however, automatic support for all, and that the merits of secession must be judged with the interests of the people in the struggle in mind, as opposed to the territorial integrity of the state. And so while Andreas Achete and Hagos Ghebreyesus went into the details about how class interests disrupt or complicate the way that the call for national self-determination might render a sort of, fallacious allyship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie of the same nation, TT rather believes that the recognition, and I'm quoting him, the recognition and support of the right of secession by revolutionary Ethiopians, especially those from the dominant nations, will foster trust and fraternity among the various nationalities. We believe that the support of the right to secession will by itself discourage secession. Now, this might be an idealistic understanding of how national self-determination would manifest in Ethiopia if prioritized, but it is nonetheless demonstrative of just how acute and really preeminent the national question was becoming in the student movement. The Tlahuntakala Thesis garnered another, pseudonymous response by Tumtu Lencho, which in reality is also a pseudonym for Andreas Achete, and that was titled The Nationalities and Class Struggle in Ethiopia. So here, TL, or Andreas, maintains that the national question can only be subordinate to the class question, like a very clear-cut He said, let me just say it that way, right? And so in a more succinct manner than in his challenge article, he reasons that the national demands of the liberation movements are justified only insofar as they do not obstruct the anti-feudalist and anti-imperialist minimum program and the maximum program of socialism that are on the revolutionary agenda of the backward countries in the new era. It is once more a sort of sobered and circumstantial application of the cause for national self-determination that TL prescribes. If the goal that unites all the branches of the Ethiopian student movement is indeed the eradication of the double bind that is feudalism and imperialism, backers of the TL thesis reason that national self-determination can be the most useful to the revolutionary agenda if the class question is not simultaneously obstructed. To be sure, this is a very difficult sort of line to toe, and you can just sort of theorize about it, but thinking about what that looks like can differ and be sort of even hard to articulate. And so although students grappling with the national question used Marxist analyses in the sort of antagonistic conclusions that they reached, both the writers of the TL and TT thesis cite Lenin and Stalin in their formulations, and although Wallein has no citations page, he did write it in prison. Won't fault him for that. It is at least partly clear that his position on secessionism was quite Stalin and Lenin-esque. And it's interesting because the national question that sort of tore asunder the fragile unity that the student movement had was quite like the one that had Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg in discord as well decades earlier. Though, Rosa Luxemburg's name is really nowhere to be sort of found cited in these various essays, that at least the essays that I've seen. In her 1916 essay titled The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, she notes early on that the position a Workers' Party assumes on the nationality question, as on every other question, must differ in method and basic approach from the positions of even the most radical bourgeois parties, and from the positions of the pseudo-socialistic petit bourgeois parties. Social democracy, whose political program is based on the scientific method of historical materialism and the class struggle, cannot make an exception with respect to the nationality question. Luxemburg also argues that the rights of nations' self-determination does not indicate to the Russian proletariat in what way it should demand a solution of the Polish national problem, the Finnish question, the Caucasian question, the Jewish, etc. That offers instead only an unlimited authorization to all interested nations to settle their national problems in any way they like. In essence, Luxemburg is concerned with the sort of practicality of asserting the right of all nations to self-determination when such assertion carries within no specific plan or sort of sensitivity to the differences in ability to achieve such a thing, when by the admission of the proponents of national self-determination for all nations, each nation constitutes its own language, culture, history, and national character. This is the same concern over sort of practicality that Andrés exhibited in his support for a more sort of case-by-case circumscribed notion of self-determination and secession. For Luxemburg and Andreas, a blanket statement simply saying the right of self-determination, sort of recognizing the right of national self-determination would not do. For Wallein, TT, and Lenin, however, recognizing this right is essential since, according to Lenin, he says the bourgeois nationalism of any oppressed nation has a general democratic content that is directed against oppression, and it is this content that we unconditionally support. At the same time, we strictly distinguish it from the tendency toward national exclusiveness. And then we can connect this back to, Wallein, because as he put it, he says the revolution can start anywhere. Hence, it would not do, to circumscribe the crucial question of national self-determination in the goal of a socialist revolution in multinational states. So the debates over such a divisive question as the national question in Ethiopia was an expression of the sort of black radical tradition, because even though there were sectors of the student movement who, through their strict reliance on Marxism made, sort of ahistorical observations of Ethiopia, there were those who did just the opposite, as in those who espoused the utility of Marxism while understanding that they must first scrutinize the particularities of Ethiopia while simultaneously putting her in context as, as an oppressed nation of the world, and sort of suggest mature and nuanced modes of resolutions as appropriate. And this is an expression of the black radical tradition in the form of what Cedric Robinson describes as the, black radical intellectual. It is how, through their use of Marxism and as members of the intelligentsia, the students made a sort of class-conscious decision to commit class suicide in the politics they espoused. They did not exhibit a total rejection of Ethiopian history as commonly understood. They frequently referred to actually the Battle of Adwa and the courageous subsequent battles waged by the peasantry in their analysis to contrast with Haile Selassie's oppressive policies. They united with the countless peasant revolts and that were taking place in the 60s and 70s, and they explicitly stated, equality between all regions and religions can be furthered by using the authentic names of the oppressed regions, learning their languages, cultures, and histories of the many regions and religions of Ethiopia, using the languages of the various regions of Ethiopia and materials for political education, recording the literature and history of the oppressed regions. This is from Andres Says. I need a new ring. This is from Andres Sachete's article, The Problems of Regionalism and Religion, Some Theoretical Considerations, right? One of the biggest critiques of the student movement is that they just were not interested in Ethiopian history, that they had a sort of instrumentalized understanding of Marxism, where it was sort of ready-made justification for the politics that they espoused, but really it was the material conditions of the masses of Ethiopians that, led them to this need to articulate like what's going on in Ethiopia, right? What's going on in Africa? How could we use Marxism to understand the conditions of Ethiopia better, articulate it, and change the situation, right? It was about sort of finding their voice, and Marxism played a role. But because they used Marxism doesn't mean that they were sort of, an aberration or sort of acting in this un-Ethiopian manner because they eventually espoused radical politics. Like, I think that's defeatist, and I think that can sort of flatten this really dynamic movement that existed among the youth in Ethiopia that, to be frank, just doesn't exist right now. There is no body of an Ethiopian youth to the extent that it was in the Ethiopian student movement today, where we're having these conferences where we were talking about, what the government is doing wrong, where we have this publication like challenge, where we're doing these sort of that doesn't exist among the Ethiopian youth in the way that it did in the 60s, right? We've been totally sort of wiped out. And I think it would be a shame to look at this particular history and say, well, these students were just acting out of, Eurocentric thinking because they used Marxism. Like, that's unfair. And I think that robs the Ethiopian youth today of a history that they could pull from to eventually be empowered again to restart this movement. And so really the entirety of my thesis is sort of concerned with this question. What does the Ethiopian student movement mean to the youth today? Obviously we can critique it. Obviously we could say they should have done this, we should have done that. We have the clarity of hindsight. We have we have that position, and it's good that we do that. But I do think that it'll be problematic to just totally to write them off as this moment in history where these kids caused all this disruption and made way for the Derg, and made way for the Red Terror, and made way for the bloodshed like that. I feel like that's an unfair reading, and so yeah, my thesis takes that on, and using the Black radical tradition, sort of reinstating them as part of this, transnational global Black revolt that was taking place in the 60s. And then you will see that too when you look at their, publications. They saw themselves as one with, the Black diaspora. They united with the Black Panther Party, other liberation struggle taking in the continent, as well as, other youth movements in other parts of the world. And I think that's an important sort of expression of their Pan-Africanist consciousness that is important to contextualizing their struggle and their politics. If they were so, poisoned by Eurocentric thinking, by using Marxism, why declare solidarity with, other African countries and their struggle against colonialism? I feel like that would be a contradiction, right? All that to say, this is just one chapter of my thesis. Taking all the natural question, I thought it would be interesting to just do a quick glance at the sort of ideological contours of the student movement. And I only used a few, I guess you can call them theoreticians, within the movement who were, more visible, who wrote a lot of the tracts, a lot of the political tracts, and did a lot of the studies that informed the congresses, that in turn informed the resolutions, that in turn informed the ideological position on these different questions of the student movement, and also over their split over this particular question, right? The national question was really, again, a divisive question in the student movement, and that led to the, splitting of the Ethiopian Student Union in North America, and the the sort of contradictory stuff that starts to come out because of this divide. And so yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I might do another video talking about like other sections of the thesis, but I don't see myself doing just a whole video of it because it's like 100 or so pages, and I'm not into editing a 1-2 hour video like that, so I'm not there yet. I'm nowhere near there yet. And so I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thanks for watching, and